In 1 Corinthians, there were a number of problems that the Apostle Paul had to address. Regrettably, the issues were many. The Apostle Paul had to spend a lot of time in writing and also in visiting with those at Corinth because they were fleshly, they were weak brethren. And the Apostle Paul had to address a number of the issues thereof. Well, greetings, I'm David Brett, bringing you Revealing the Truth. And today we want to continue in the series of 1 Corinthians issues, or the Corinthian issues. And we looked at who to follow, adultery, litigation, marriage was the last episode. Today we're going to look into sacrifices to idols, interestingly enough. Now this spans roughly from chapter 8 and through chapter 10. And it starts out, now concerning things sacrificed to idols, in verse 1 of chapter 8. And verse 4, things sacrificed to idols. Now, this is somewhat detached for us because we don't think of sacrificing anything to anyone, let alone idols. In our society today, you know, we're busy with careers and with schooling and work oriented type things, you know, building a house, hobbies, you know, we have recreational activities. Of course, in Corinth, they had recreational activities too. They had basically a theater type of coliseum where 20,000 could gather and watch plays, watch the hypocrites, which are actors essentially. And, you know, this was sort of the society back then. And we have some similarities, but there are some things that just seem detached. Sacrifices to idols. Why is that an issue? Well, the different pagan temples that were set up at the time would sacrifice to various like goat demons and different idols like Baal and these type of things. And they had temple prostitutes and different things going on that we normally don't see today, but was prevalent at this time in the first century. And at Corinth, certainly like the Las Vegas of the Mediterranean there, they certainly had different things going on. Now, while we have entertainment, that's, you know, something that's comparable, but they had meat markets in which sacrificed animals would be, you know, purchased by, it's like almost like a farmer's market today. We would go there, find tomatoes and lettuce and different things that we could purchase and take home and eat. But meat markets were a typical farmer's market back at this time in the first century. But there were pagans that were selling their food, their items on the tables. And the question comes up, well, you know, do we eat such things? Do we not eat such things? Well, the Apostle Paul says, food will not commend us to Elohim. We are neither the worse off if we do not eat, nor the better if we eat. This is found in verse 8 of chapter 8. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that some brethren evidently thought that there might be some mystical problems or spiritual issues with eating a sacrificed animal. Now, when we think of an animal, we think of, you know, going to the store and buying something that's all wrapped up. Well, these were animals that you'd have to cut up and eat and, you know, prepare at home. But they didn't have them, you know, prepared like we would see today. But there was a sense that maybe the goat demon or something might have an issue. But the Apostle Paul basically says that, you know, certain brethren that have an issue there, we don't want to offend them, and if their conscience is weak. Verse 12, and it says, well, verse 11, for through your knowledge he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake the Messiah died, and by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against the Messiah. So it's a very serious issue. So if a weak brother might find it offensive to have purchased, say a sheep that was, or a goat that was sacrificed to an idol, you wouldn't want to cause or rub it in the weak brother's face. We may not have any problem with eating such meats, whether they were sacrificed or not, but some back at this time evidently did. And we find this kind of continuing with the idea of wounding the conscience and such in chapter 10, and going in verse 14, says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Now, the problem could arise that a person would think more along the lines of maybe getting more power, running to and grabbing a sacrificed animal to somehow receive more power. These are things that were in their minds, but not necessarily in our minds, unless we look through this and try to understand what was happening at the time. Just like drinking blood, which is absolutely forbidden, but yet was occurring at that time for the people, pagan rituals and such, and they felt like they would get more power. Well, there's some animals that had strong testosterone levels in their blood and these type of things, and those hormones, when you drink the blood, would actually make you feel better, make you feel stronger, make you feel energized. And so there's the concept physically and also spiritually that, well, you'd receive power if you ate the meat of some sacrificed animal. This is sort of the concept that we want to kind of understand back, that was going on back at that time. Again, it's not going on today, but back then, even in ancient times, going back to Leviticus 17 and verse 7, you read of goat demons there, and these type of things, went on. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 19, starting there through 21, what do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or not an idol is anything? Well, no, verse 20. But I say the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons, and not to Elohim. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. You cannot drink the cup of the master and drink the cup of demons. That may have been involving blood as well. And you cannot partake of the table of the master and the table of demons. And what Paul is talking about is syncretism or polytheism, and that was common back at that time. And he even had to address the issue with the Galatians in chapter 4, which is different than Colossians 2. Now, the different idols, they had their own special days and their times and seasons, these type of things. And evidently, those in Galatia we're kind of falling back to that. I mean, when you go through each of these books, you find different information that's provided. Colossians 2 talks about just the opposite, not allowing men to tell you about how to keep Yahweh's holy days, for example, or new moons, these type of things, which set the times for the feast days, for example, that are mentioned in Leviticus 23. These are things that, if we understand, Genesis to Malachi, for example, we'll understand Matthew to Revelation, especially when we get into letters such as this. Now, as we go through here, we find some mention of ancient Israel coming out of the Egypt and making their way. When we look at such things, we gain insight. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 16. Now these things happen as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things that they also craved. Well, they craved the physical. They looked and were looking for onions and leeks and melons and these type of things. They were looking for physical sustenance. Well, Yahweh provides physically for us, but He also provides a spiritual, which is more important. And Yahweh, in dealing with them, gave them quail for a month, and it came out their ears and noses, essentially, figuratively, to where they even loathed that. So, there's lessons that they were learning. In verse 7, speaking of idols, do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up and play. Well, they made a golden calf. The idea of worshiping animals. They had a golden calf, and they said, this is Yahweh who has brought you out of Egypt. It was utterly an abomination to Yahweh. In verse 8 here, continuing in 1 Corinthians 10, let us not act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Baal of Peor, or Lord of the opening, which was a sensual sin, immorality that the people had. And the Israelites were kind of getting caught up with these type of things. And the foreign element that they came out with from Egypt didn't help. In verse 9 it says, nor let us try the master or Yahweh as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. And even a bronze serpent was set up so that they could be healed. And that sounds a little odd, but again, we're finding some allusions even to the Messiah, which we wouldn't normally think of a bronze serpent, but they looked at that and were healed. And it was something that was told by Yahweh for the people to do so that they would learn. But what did they learn? Well, they ended up worshiping the bronze serpent, and it was just the people couldn't get their focus correctly. They needed to focus on Yahweh alone, and Yahweh makes that point when it comes to idol worship in Isaiah 42 through about 48 there, I think. All the I statements, there must be at least 50 or 100, of which Yahweh is emphasizing He is the one to worship, that nothing else compares to Him. No one is beside Him but He alone, and He is the one to worship. And even Yahshua said, why do you call me good? There's no one good but Yahweh. And He was with Yahweh from the beginning, as we have read. Well, in verse 10 of 10, it says, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. And of course, the people rebelled with Korah, and the ground opened up, and that was an example for the people as well. And so there are a number of things that happened in the past that the Apostle Paul is relating to those in Corinth. And verse 11, he continues to say, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages has come. As the Apostle Peter mentioned, the Apostle Paul was hard to understand at times in his writings. And in some cases, he doesn't want us to partake of idolatry meats. And yet here in 1 Corinthians 10:25, he says, eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. Well, he's kind of going back to, the issues that were at that time, and hard for us to understand some of the things he was saying because of that. But he was concerned about not offending weaker brethren. There are different aspects of that we could look at in Romans 14, for example. Some brethren just wanted to eat vegetables, and so vegetarianism, we even have that today. We don't want to offend someone or rub that in their face, as evidently some brethren had done, and Paul was aware of. And there were certain brethren in Romans 14, for example, that chose to, fast on one day or another, and there were customs in which some, including the Pharisees, would fast twice a month, or twice a week, and like maybe a Tuesday and a Thursday, and then the rest of the week they would eat. Well, Paul said, don't cause offense even in that, but certainly don't take such things like that to the extreme where you disfigure your face, as some of the Pharisees were evidently doing. And so there are different things that were occurring in the first century that, historical accounts and writings are good to review along with Scripture, because it does bring out certain things and aspects that we would otherwise not be privy to. But we get a sense of these things, and speaking about drinking blood and temple prostitutes and such like that, we find in Acts 15 and verse 29 that you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, things that were involved in false worship. Backing up to verse 20, we write to them that they abstain from these things contaminated by idols and fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. And he goes on to say, for Moses from ancient generations has in every city those who preach him, since he is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. And so the idea would be that the people would learn, but let's get these most disgusting and abominable things out of their lives, and then help them to learn further. And so as we come to the close of 1 Corinthians 10, basically, he says, the Apostle Paul, verse 32, give no offense either to Jew or to Greeks or to the church or the assembly of Yahweh. And so he was a man of peace, though he didn't withhold the information from those he was teaching. And so we have all this information for us today to peruse and to go over. But I would say this for today, while we don't have little statutes and golden calves and stuff like this, we do have what could be considered idolatry, even adultery, figuratively, symbolically, in that people focus so much on sports, or so much on their careers, or so much on a hobby, or so much on getting wealth and and building houses and such, that they forget what Yahweh has for them, and they don't spend time in the Word. They don't spend time in congregating and fellowshipping, and coming before Yahweh on His appointed times. The first of which, mentioned in Leviticus 23, is the weekly Sabbath. It's the seventh day. And that day hasn't changed. And scholars go back and find that the Messiah didn't have a problem with that day with the Pharisees. He had a problem with them adding to and taking away and basically distorting His Father's instructions. And so we remove the traditions out of our lives, both on the side of Judaism and also on the side of Christianity. And we come before Yahweh, studying His Word, not getting caught up in idolatry or adultery of the world, but focusing on what Yahweh would have for us. And we want to do what's pleasing in His sight, doing what's right in His sight. So the Apostle Paul, moving to a different subject now, getting into headship, we find in verse 1 of 11, starting there, be imitators of me just as I am of Messiah. Now, you have to understand, this is about 25 years later after the Messiah has risen. He's still using the Messiah as a standard. He also uses Yahweh's word as a standard, but we know that the Messiah didn't sin, and so we can follow in his footsteps and see a living image of what the written law looks like in action. And also, a step above what is written, because when you go into Matthew 5, you find that we're not even to think about harming a brother or being angry with him, let alone kill the individual, because things that lead to physical acts of disobedience to Yahweh and against our fellow man would stem from the heart, the emotions, the seat, in our thinking. So just something to consider. In verse 2 it goes on, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly through traditions. Now there are some traditions that are good, certainly there's some are bad, just as I delivered them to you. So as the Messiah's custom was, it's mentioned that he would go to the synagogue and even read from the scriptures, certainly proclaiming himself in those scriptures, such as Isaiah. In verse 3 it continues, but I want you to understand that the Messiah is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman. And Elohim, or Yahweh, is the head of Messiah. Now, why is he bringing this up? Because he's going to get into a section here that talks about head coverings for women and not head coverings for man. And now you'll see traditions in Judaism today in which the men will wear what's called a kippah or a yarmulke. And they'll go to the Wailing Wall, which is probably a wall from Aelia Capitolina, a Roman city that was built upon Jerusalem there. Nevertheless, we find traditions that are not in accordance with Scripture. Now we do find, David covered his head in 2 Samuel 15:30 through 31, but that was in mourning. And there are times in which, sackcloth and ashes, symbolically, we go through and we symbolically cover our heads in mourning. But for worship, coming before Yahweh, that is not something that we would want to do. Now he goes on to here to say that every man, in verse 4, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying or teaching, worshiping, disgraces his head. And Paul goes through the rest, describing different aspects of why, analogies. In fact, we have a YAIY quick study sheet concerning women's head coverings. And the reason we believe that it is appropriate for women to wear a head covering is because of this section here, and because of other former Testament writings in which we find from Genesis to Malachi some indicators there that it was done as a custom or tradition. But there's spiritual reasons for this today. Now, just some points to consider in 1 Corinthians 11:3 through 16 is the order of headship, or the authority, is being pointed out first and foremost. It is also shameful for women not to wear a cover on their heads or hair while praying or prophesying. Just the opposite for a man. And we read in verse 7, for a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of Elohim, but the woman is the glory of the man. Now Paul used the example of cutting one hair off completely in verse 6, providing an example of how inappropriate it would be for a woman not to wear head coverings. Now there is a tradition in Judaism in which women, they read this passage and other areas and they think, well, they'll go ahead and shave their heads and wear a wig, and that is their head covering. It's taking things to the extreme, and that's what the Pharisees did. The plain instructions are simple, easy to follow, and it's a matter of, because of the angels and their viewing, the obedience of the headship that Yahweh has ordained. That's what it comes down to in this whole area. And in verse 10, for example, therefore the women ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels and Malachim. And we are to properly judge the rhetorical question of whether it is or whether it is not appropriate. And there is no other tradition or custom for sisters in the assembly of Yahweh, according to the close of this, where Paul says, if one is inclined to be contentious, in verse 16, we have no other practice, nor have the assemblies of Elohim. So he closes out this section. Now, you know, I have Ryerie's Study Bible, and I'm reading out of the New American Standard Bible with this. And it's interesting, some of the notes he brings up. But because of time, I'm not going to go through all that, though you're welcome to contact us for this sheet. We also have headship study that goes over this. So if you'd like to know more, you know, go to 1 Corinthians 11, the first part there. You can also request other information from us as we go into other areas, such as 2 Samuel 15, 30 through 31. Look at the context there and consider the physical and spiritual aspect that's being brought out by the Apostle Paul. And we see that we do learn spiritual lessons by doing certain physical things. And so we look at this and consider that for our walk in Messiah today. Again, some of these things, when we go back, they weren't done, you know, they are not typically done today. As we look back, it was more common. I suppose you could consider, you know, the Roaring '20s of America, in which everyone wore a hat. It was just a custom. All the men wore beards back at this time. It's not so much of a custom today for us. But there are certain things that, because of the spiritual aspect, we should really be considering the physical things that are done there for that spiritual insight, and out of respect for the headship that Yahweh has ordained. Again, verse 10, therefore the women ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the Malachim, the angels.